Hey everyone, it's Jenna. This week we are releasing another episode that Michael and Chris and I recorded in our last day or two together in the office before the pandemic hit. But it feels just as relevant today, if not more so than it did before COVID-19. Our topic is free speech, which we've seen play out in the protests to reopen states across the country. We've seen it in the response that the social media platforms have had to how they're dealing with misinformation and fake news surrounding the pandemic. So lots of things to think about regarding free speech in our current moments. But this episode does a great job of laying out the historical framework for the First Amendment and what the founders had in mind when they were thinking about these issues, and how those principles have changed over time to adapt to new communication tools and technologies. So we hope you enjoy this conversation about free speech. And finally, we are taking questions still for our listener mailbag episode, the second annual Democracy Works listener mailbag. If you have a question about anything we've covered on the show, about COVID-19 and democracy, anything else democracy related that's on your mind, you can head to democracyworkspodcast.com/question or click on the link in the show notes and send us your question. We'll read as many of them as we can on the show, and you will also be entered into a drawing for a Democracy Works coffee mug. So again, send us your questions at democracyworkspodcast.com/question and enjoy this episode on free speech.
You can't, Madison said, have a Republican form of government without a broad right of the people to examine public characters and measures, as he put it. How would you elect people? How would you examine candidates for public office? How would you unelect someone who you thought was doing a bad job if you couldn't critique that person?
From the McCourtney Institute for Democracy on the campus of Penn State University, I'm Michael Berkman.
And I'm Chris Beam.
I'm Jenna Spinelli, and welcome to Democracy Works. Today, guys, we are talking about free speech, something that we hear a lot about here on a college campus. But our guest today is going to take a bit of a different approach to it, more of a historical context. We are joined by Stephen Solomon, who is the author of a book called Revolutionary Dissent, How the Founding Generation Created the Freedom of Speech, also a Penn State alumnus, and dare I say it, he is more into the Founding Fathers than you guys are. I never thought I would say that, but I think it's true.
Well, he is an historian.
That's not a point in his favor, but maybe our listeners will think otherwise. All right, well, so why don't we start by just kind of laying out what freedom of speech means, where it comes from, and how it kind of relates to some other civil rights that we know.
Civil liberties.
Civil liberties.
Yeah, because there's an important distinction between a civil liberty and a civil right.
Okay. All right, if you can do that in 2 sentences, do that and then move on.
Civil liberties are about restricting government power. Civil rights are about using government power to protect certain groups.
Okay, and freedom of speech is?
A protection from government power. If you read the First Amendment, it starts, Congress shall make no law that abridges, and then they go into, right, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of religion.
Freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and then freedom of grievances.
You would have thought for this podcast we'd have the First Amendment in front of us.
We should have, yeah. But I mean, that's the 5. So.
I hear it's on that Google machine.
Yeah. In any case, so freedom of speech is one of these civil liberties that are
First Amendment, first one,
right? And it wasn't originally part. They're called amendments because they weren't originally in the Constitution.
It was a big part of the fight between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, because the Anti-Federalists wanted protections against excessive government power, which of course is what a lot of the framing period was about, and the Federalists were not opposed to that idea, but rather they argued that we don't need to give protections against powers that we haven't given in the first place.
Right.
And so they did argue, that since government doesn't explicitly in the Constitution have the power to, for example, restrict speech or something having to do with the establishment of religion, also part of the First Amendment, then we don't have to worry about them making laws that way. They quickly learned that the Constitution could be used differently.
Well, and they quickly learned that as part of the politics of getting the thing ratified, they promised that they would put in this Bill of Rights.
And then there was that.
So we could argue, I think, that the history of jurisprudence in, especially the Supreme Court cases, was trying to understand what the First Amendment means with regards to freedom of speech, what are the legitimate limitations that we can place on it, and what is it, and these are still fights that are going on to this day, right?
Right.
So,
because all of these rights are not absolute.
Of course.
There are restrictions on them.
There have to be, right?
Yeah.
The classic is...
Don't yell fire in a crowded theater.
Fire in a theater. The other thing is we're talking about political speech, right? So, if you are...
Well, there are distinctions between types of speech.
Right.
There's political speech, which is the most protected.
That's the most protected.
I'm not a First Amendment expert, but
no,
it's
but that's
the most
right.
protected.
Yeah.
There's commercial speech, which is much less protected.
One of the most germane and difficult questions around free speech right now is in the context of these brand new public forums, namely Twitter and Facebook.
Right.
And they're private corporations, and they do not have to put any restrictions on speech. And yet, because they are such a forum for not only false information, but deliberately misleading information, lies, efforts to deceive, it becomes very difficult to have what in American jurisprudence has long been called the marketplace of ideas.
Yeah, there might be a point at which they become so big.
Right.
And of course, this is where you get into issues of a kind of how do you read the Constitution in the modern age? What did they know about this? Right.
Of course.
This was an age of partisan newspapers,
horses.
if anything, right? Horses. And so the idea of this private network developing that has such a vital role to play in political speech, to the extent where it could even be decisive in a presidential election, really just speaks to the ambiguity of this time.
This speaks to the metaphor of the marketplace of ideas, right? Because this is a product of this kind of Enlightenment thought that produced the Constitution, produced the First Amendment. Thomas Jefferson said, "Truth is great and will prevail if left unto herself." In a world where there are literally billions of people on Facebook, where tweets can become a tweet storm instantly, the prospect for that being true is just not as...
Yeah.
It's not as true as it used to be.
Let's bring in the First Amendment expert here. I think you'll hear Steve has thoughts about the marketplace of ideas, how we came to this notion, and where we might go from here given this context of social media. So let's go now to my interview with Steve Solomon. This is Jenna Spinelli here today with Stephen Solomon. Stephen, thanks for joining us on Democracy Works.
Thanks for inviting me.
So we are going to be talking about free speech and the First Amendment more broadly today. And your book, Revolutionary Dissent, kind of traces some of the history of the First Amendment and how it came to be what we all know and I think as Americans hold so dear today. And just given the place that the First Amendment has in like the American psyche, I think it's easy to forget about what things were like before it was in place. So can you take us back to the pre-Bill of Rights era and talk about what the free speech, free press environment was like at that time?
Well, the whole Revolutionary era from 1765 right through the next 10 or 15 years was an era of tremendous protest, demonstrations, and all of these protests were actually a violation of seditious libel laws, which traces their roots to the 13th century in England, when Parliament passed a law which made it a crime to criticize the king or other important men of the realm, as they put it. The freedom of the press was defined as the freedom from prior censorship. But once you published something, if you criticized the government or a government official, you could be criminally prosecuted. And in fact, many people were. And before 1700, there were something like 1,200 seditious libel prosecutions in the colonies. This is all in colonial court records. And there were some very severe punishments for criticisms that we just take for granted today. So when you get into 50, 75 years later, into the 18th century and the protests against the Stamp Act, these were people coming out, protesting in the streets and writing pamphlets and complaining with letters and essays and newspapers. These were at least technically violations of the law. And but over a period of time, the protests became so popular and they used so many forms. It wasn't just the pamphlets and the essays and the letters, written by relatively learned people, but also in the streets. The liberty trees and liberty poles and the symbolic speech in other ways, the hanging of effigies of the British Prime Minister along with the devil, the meetings that people had in coffee houses and so forth. Protests spread and the public sphere of political expression expanded dramatically. So the law still existed, but it was ignored and it was unenforceable. And so what you see out of this period was an enlargement of the public sphere of political expression, and especially protest. And that becomes, in a way, part of the political culture of the country to be.
Yeah, so it seems like there's kind of this tension between the citizens that have this kind of revolutionary attitude, spirit, kind of butting up against the remnants of the legal structure that the U.S. was born out of, coming from England.
Right, and if you ask yourself, what did the people understand to be their freedom? Well, if you're a citizen and you've been out at the Liberty Tree, and there have been demonstrations and there have been effigies of the British Prime Minister, and you've been marching in the street and you've been talking about things in coffee houses and you've been reading pamphlets, what would you think your freedom of speech was coming out of that period? I suspect you might think that you had these freedoms that were not actually protected by law. And so that, I think, in some ways gave rise to the political culture that was to come. And what was to come was, even after the First Amendment, well, before the First Amendment was even discussed as a right, you had the ratification period where, many historians call that the greatest debate in American history. And it wasn't all pleasant. There was, very deeply written and argued essays and, of course, the Federalist Papers and all. But there was also a lot of vitriolic speech and nasty, essays and nasty poetry. And there are all kinds of stuff, the kind of stuff we see today. So that this whole culture of debate, not just in the Revolutionary period, but extending to ratification, was part of what people just engaged in and understood and expected.
Mm-hmm. And that, I think, takes us forward in history to 1800. You just mentioned the Federalist Papers. We love a good Federalist Papers reference on this show. But your work talks about Madison's report of 1800, where he, as I understand it, kind of lays out the argument for freedom of speech and freedom of the press as we know it today.
Exactly. He laid out his idea of how freedom of the press was essentially part of American self-governance. He compared the American system with Britain, and in Britain, sovereignty was with the king and parliament. In America, there was a whole different idea. Sovereignty was with the people. We the people, of course, is how the Constitution starts. And you can't, Madison said, have a Republican form of government without a broad right of the people to examine public characters and measures, as he put it, examine public characters and measures without worrying about the government punishing you for those ideas. How would you elect people? How would you examine candidates for public office? How would you unelect someone who you thought was doing a bad job if you couldn't critique that person? And that was simply, it couldn't be squared with the idea of a self-governing society. And so In fact, one could argue that even in the absence of a First Amendment explicitly protecting freedom of the press, freedom of speech, such a right is implied by a Republican form of government. I mean, I think you can take that from his writings, the one that you can have self-governance in a Republican form of government as was established by the Constitution without a protected right to examine public characters and measures.
Right. And then that, again, as I understand it, kind of evolves through some later court cases and things. It's like marketplace of ideas theory that we hear about, and then the answer to bad speech is more speech, and kind of a lot of the things that we think about today when we think about free speech.
Yeah, so Madison was very much concerned about the model of free speech related to self-governance, that it was essential to a self-governing society. And of course, if you go back to the Enlightenment writers, you have Mill and Milton writing about the value of the marketplace of ideas, and you needed a marketplace to sort out ideas. And they were pushing it back against official censorship. And it shouldn't be within the power of a king or any public official to say what ideas are right and what ideas are wrong. It's up to the marketplace to determine that. And truth grapples with falsity. And in the end, at least we hope that truth will rise to the top. No guarantees of that, but probably better to rely on the marketplace than some authoritarian selection of what the best ideas are. The entire history of free speech and free press is a pushback against that. It's a pushback against the idea that some authoritarian power, whether it's a king, a president, any public official, can define what ideas are right and what ideas are wrong. It's up to the people to decide that, of course, within certain limits, because nobody is really going to stand up and favor speech that incites directly and immediately incites lawless action. And there are other things that are within the exceptions to the First Amendment, but anything involving the discussion of public ideas and governance should be protected. The other thing I think that Madison said that was really important is that, of course, we're all human beings and we're going to make mistakes, and you have to expect some bad behavior by journalists, bad behavior by citizens who might speak falsely, and that's part of the marketplace of ideas as well. If you punish false statements too harshly, you'll chill speech. Because after all, many of us say things in public debate. We think we're right. Maybe it's a half-truth. Maybe it's just we're just not careful enough, but we misspeak sometimes. And you have to be very careful about protecting that kind of speech as well, so as not to chill public debate and discussion.
Yeah. So, up to this point, we've been talking about freedom of speech and freedom of the press as two separate things, I think, and tell me if this is right or not, because throughout history they were, because there was this like press on the one side, the mass media kind of model, whether it was pamphlets to newspapers to TV and on and on and on, and then there was individual speech on the other side. But I feel like we're at this place today where everybody has their own platform and everybody is kind of their own press these days, so the lines have gotten much blurrier.
Oh, they have. Well, it used to be we were in a long period of time where there were gatekeepers, right? There were the big news organizations, and whether they were networks, TV networks, or big news organizations in print, and you couldn't get published. You couldn't get your ideas out there very easily unless that gatekeeper said, yes, that's a good idea, I'll publish that. Well, now, anybody who has access to the internet can put up their ideas in an instant. Everybody, in fact, becomes a journalist, don't they? Because you're walking across a public park or something, and you see something that's going on, you can whip out your cell phone and make photographs or a video. Not only can you do that and record what's going on, but you can immediately upload it and millions of people can see it right away.
Yeah. So I mean, on its face, that sounds like a good thing. I mean, who wouldn't want more ideas, more coverage, more lights out there to be shine on what bad things may or may not be happening in the world? But I also wonder if the marketplace of ideas has just gotten so big that there is almost like this chilling effect of like we're kind of afraid to say things sometimes because we worry about what the repercussions will be online and social media and these kind of things.
There's certainly many instances of people putting out their ideas up there and then being so harshly attacked that they have to get off the medium. They have to shut down their accounts, or they may even need protection, and that obviously that's regrettable. But that comes from universal access to this incredible medium of communication. And also, I think the other issue which comes into play is with so many people out there with access to the communications, including governments that we don't like. It gets to a point where it's very hard to determine truth from falsity. I mean, yes, it's a big marketplace of ideas, but the intentional fabrication of information, and even to the extent of these deep fake videos, makes it very hard for individuals to determine what's true and what's false. And people have either get the wrong ideas about what's going on because it's all fake, or they just can't determine what's true or false, and they throw up their arms and say, what am I supposed to do now?
We hear Mark Zuckerberg and some of these other tech executives use some of the same marketplace of ideas as a defense of their kind of corporate practices of not removing certain posts or speech or people from their platform. So that's not the government, but I'm wondering if there's an argument there that these platforms have just as much reach, if not a bigger reach, than the government does today, and certainly did back in history, and so is where does that all fit in here? I mean, how should these companies be thinking about the First Amendment when it comes to their work, and how should we be thinking about it as citizens that are interacting with them, getting our news from them, just being on these platforms as part of our daily lives?
Yeah, so these are questions that are very much debated today. If you go back sort of into the traditional forums, you have streets, sidewalks, and parks where people gathered to protest, to discuss issues. This goes back, as we talked about, to colonial times. And there's very well-established First Amendment principles about the government can't interfere in that realm, can't censor speech based on disagreement with a viewpoint that is expressed. The question today is, even while the streets, sidewalks, and parks remain a public forum, we've migrated a lot of our public discussion to another forum to which the First Amendment doesn't so easily apply, and that's electronic media that's owned by private parties like Facebook, Twitter, and much of the conversation is carried on there today as an addition to what goes on in the real public square, the sort of the traditional public square. But it's owned by Facebook, it's owned by Twitter. And there are varying viewpoints about whether and how private parties should, if at all, censor speech. So one could argue that in such an important sphere of public discussion, that why should anybody have the power, Mark Zuckerberg, to, if he wanted to, censor speech on any topic? He has vast power. Now there are terms of use that people have to agree to be on that platform, and they censor already hate speech, and they're required by the European Union to do so. But they don't have a First Amendment. The government couldn't require that here. But these private platforms have an enormous amount of power. So one could argue, well, he should arbitrate and eliminate some voices that are putting out fake videos and denying that that the Sandy Hook massacre occurred. Things that are demonstrably false. And there's others who say, no, nobody should have that power, because that puts him in the position of being the most powerful person in America, in a sense, of being able to say what people can write and publish and what they can't.
Who weighs in here? Who decides, if anyone, I guess? Is this something the Supreme Court should take up, or who kind of moves this needle forward? As you said, there's lots of opinions out there, but a lack of real consensus about what to do about it.
These cases are just starting to come before the Supreme Court and the federal courts in general. One of the interesting cases involving social media, is President Trump and other politicians who are using their Twitter and Facebook accounts to discuss public affairs, and they're using it as a public forum. So Donald Trump started his @RealDonaldTrump as a private Twitter account. Now, anybody who has a private Twitter account can control that account. They can add people. They can block people, and there's no real controversy about that. The question is, what happens when you have this private platform and you use it for public business? And so President Trump and other public officials around the country have used their Twitter accounts and Facebook accounts as public spaces where they say, they may not actually say this, but they use it. They make all their public pronouncements, they comment on issues. That sounds like President Trump, right? Well, if you're using it in that way, do you have the right to cut people off? Do you have the right to block people? And President Trump blocked people who were talking back to him. They challenged him in court, and the courts so far have said that he created a public forum. He opened up his Twitter account to discussions of public affairs. He uses it as an official platform. And as such, he can't then make decisions about cutting people off because he disagrees with their viewpoint, because they're pushing back. And so that's kind of an interesting idea because, again, Twitter is a private platform. Normally, people would have the power to cut people off. But if you're a public official and you're using it as the same way you would use, let's say, the White House for a press conference, or you're using a public park to give a speech, then maybe it starts to look more like a public park rather than a private account. So,
let's maybe come back to this idea of self-censorship. I mean, what do you see happening there? I mean, if you again think about our media climate today, it doesn't seem like that's going to get any better. I mean, I hear from students that sometimes when they're in class, they feel like they can't speak up, or they don't want to speak up because they're afraid of how what they say will be perceived. And there's, as we kind of said before, this whole other chilling effect that's also happening. So what do we do about that, or where do you think that's likely to go?
I think there is a chilling effect that has to do with peer pressure, and I think you see that on college campuses. Some campuses may be predominantly liberal, some may be predominantly conservative, and I think there may be on some campuses a culture in which it's very difficult for someone who has a divergent view to feel that they can put it out there and still have friends. And I think that is, if you're a teenager, whether in high school or in college, that's a difficult thing to deal with. And people may, in fact, be chilled in that way. I think to the extent possible, speech on college campuses should mirror what goes on in society at large. Free speech is tumultuous. It is really wide open. It's often vitriolic. I'm not in favor of people shouting at each other, but that's part of it, I guess, because we're human beings and we have part of what we put into our thoughts is an emotional element. And I think that on college campuses, you can't interfere with one another and threaten one another, but a strong campus of where people can put their views out there, divergent views, and have productive discussions is the way to prepare oneself for a civil society, and as a model for how we resolve questions on which we disagree. So, yeah, I think there is that element of peer pressure, and I'm not sure how you get around that, except for professors making it very clear to students that, in their classrooms, that all views on the subject matter at discussion are welcome, and there's not necessarily a right answer to the issues that are being discussed. They're just different opinions, and you have to back up your opinions with facts, with historical context. That's critical reasoning.
So, the other thing that we hear about in the kind of college campus free speech discussion is that people, particularly on the left side of the spectrum, consider some acts of speech to be violence, and that kind of those two are blurring. So, what do you make of that from a First Amendment perspective?
A lot of the complaints have to do with words that offend people. They could be slurs, they could be ideas that are offensive to students and others, and one of the questions was a number of questions that come up. How would you, even if you wanted to regulate such speech, how would you do that? Who do you trust? Who do you trust to make those decisions? Are you going to put that in the hands of the president of Congress? Are you going to put that in the hands of the university president to make decisions about what's offensive and what isn't? How are you going to make those kinds of decisions? And what does offensive even mean? I mean, it means different things in different contexts. If you go back to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, what demonstrators in favor of equal rights were doing in the South was offensive to the Southern way of life. And so what did you see? It was police out with hoses and dogs set upon demonstrators. First Amendment was the friend of progressive values, and I think it has been through American history. Offensive speech is a very dangerous thing to regulate because it's an inherently vague concept, and it implies that someone can make a decision on what's offensive and what's not offensive, and that person is an authoritarian figure, and generally that can't come out well.
Right, which people, the same people making these claims, probably wouldn't want that type of outcome either.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's right. I think a lot of people who want that kind of regulation assume that all the regulation will be to their benefit, and if you self-define as part of a group that's been oppressed, for example, what really makes you think that suddenly the powers that be will outlaw speech that does really offend you? Maybe it'll be the other way around because you don't have the power.
Well, not the most optimistic note, but we sometimes end that way around here. But thank you for your work and your book and the history lesson today and the context for where things stand. And thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for inviting me here.
I really found this conversation really interesting in terms of how it speaks to the distinctiveness of the American understanding of free speech, right? You have this, his argument is that it all comes out of the revolution. And our understanding of free speech is directly associated with Americans' rejection of the king and the laws against speaking ill of the king.
But it's not like free speech was separated out and even incorporated into the Constitution in the first place. Rather, it's one of a list of protections.
I agree.
So it gets the privilege of the First Amendment, right? But it's in there with a whole bunch of other things as well.
That's true. But his argument, it seems to me, is that this is about our political culture, right? That there is this idea that being an American means that you have the right and even the kind of expectation that if you don't like what you're getting from your government, you should say something.
Right. I mean, there are other democracies European democracies that don't have these
Right.
protections. And so, for example, and I'm no expert in this area, but Germany, you can't say certain things about. You can't. Holocaust denial is illegal.
Right.
Yeah, he raises another issue, which is more relevant, I think, to our times right now in this country, about the notion of self-censoring speech.
Yeah, and in college.
In particular, on colleges. Yeah.
So the argument is that colleges are kind of fiefdoms of the left, and that most professors are, Democrats at minimum. And so
Trying
if you
to
are
indoctrinate their students.
right, exactly.
Yes.
And if you are a conservative, either by upbringing or by disposition, you don't feel like your point of view is respected or that you can even offer it.
I think a lot of those concerns are way overstated,
I do too.
although I do think that diversity in the academy is important.
I agree with that.
And
there are outliers within the academy where their critique is far more germane than it is here at Penn
Yeah, but it's
State.
also
But
just
still.
that, diversity is important for all kinds of reasons.
Yep.
And
especially intellectual diversity.
Yes, the self-censorship in the classrooms, which I think is kind of a newer thing. At least I don't remember hearing about this for years and years. And it seems like we hear a lot more about it now. And this is the idea that students are afraid to speak. And, I think because they will be seen by their professor perhaps as, being against their point of view. Although from research I've read on this, it's more that they self-censor because of their concerns about other students.
I think that's
because
right.
Because
the
of the
peer
professor.
peer effect is very powerful.
But you see, I think this speaks much more to problems with polarization than it does to free speech issues.
And I think that's what he would say too. I mean, he did say that, right? Why should college be any different than the other dimension of American life right now?
Yeah, we're in a time of affective polarization,
Right.
Affective partisanship. I'm sorry, where you tend to really see people of the other party and your own party. So if you are a Republican student in a room that could very well be in this day and age 80% Democrat or at least 80%
Depending on the
non-Trump
class,
supporting,
right?
Yeah, so depending on the class, then it can be uncomfortable to speak, and it takes a skilled instructor.
Right.
To make sure that they feel comfortable to do that.
The other dimension of free speech in college life that I think is worth bringing up here is this question, or the critique of free speech on the left, right? Where you can make claims that are genuinely violent, that are the functional equivalent of a violent act against a person. Say if you're saying something, misogynistic or transphobic or homophobic, right? Your speech is unacceptable because the person who is receiving it finds it so upsetting as to be violent, and therefore that is grounds for restricting it.
Right. Well, this was what Jonathan Haidt talked
Right.
about quite a bit when he was here, and I would recommend going back to that podcast because he's about as interesting a person on talking about these campus free speech issues as
true.
Is out there right now.
And his argument is that if you are going, it's not that dissimilar from Madison's, right? If you are going to accept free speech, you have to accept the fact that you're going to hear things that you don't like.
Especially in an academic setting.
You're going to have to accept that. And even if it is hurtful, you have to do that. Now, the immediate response is going to be, listen to the two old white males talking about this, right? And that's not false. That's worth hearing. But the fundamental core of this Madisonian point remains that you cannot escape. You cannot set parameters around speech that deny someone's ability to say something and call it free speech.
Yeah, that democracies require the ability to be able to do that.
Right, and the ability to accept
Yeah.
discomfort and to accept hearing things you don't want to hear.
Indeed, the discomfort might be exactly what the speaker wants. That sometimes it's necessary to feel discomfort, to appreciate circumstances.
And as we all know, if you're going to change your mind about something, that experience almost invariably involves some dimension of discomfort.
Exactly.
Anyway, so thanks to Steve for coming to campus and for being a great alumnus, great representative of dear old state. Thanks to Jenna Spinelli for a terrific interview, and thanks to all for you for listening. I'm Chris Beam.
I'm Michael Burke.
This has been Democracy Works.
Democracy Works is produced by the McCourtney Institute for Democracy at Penn State and WPSU Penn State, Central Pennsylvania's NPR station. Episodes are engineered by Andy Grant and Craig Johnson, edited by Chris Kugler and Mark Stitzer, and reviewed by Emily Reddy. Our interns this semester are Nicole Grayson and Stephanie Crane, two graduating seniors in the Donald P. Belisario College of Communications at Penn State. If you like what you heard today, please leave us a rating or review in your favorite podcast app. Democracy Works is part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts focused on civic engagement, civil discourse, and democracy. Visit democracygroup.org to learn more about our member shows and view playlists on topics like immigration and impeachment that are curated from across member shows. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.